I am here in beautiful Carolina Meadows in North Carolina, and I have been blessed with the opportunity to meet up with Mr. Bob Huddleston. And we are going to talk about the P-47 Thunderbolt. But before we do that, I'll just read my little introduction here. So Robert Huddleston was awarded the coveted Silver Wings of an Army Air Corps pilot at the age of 19. This was followed by extensive training in the P-47 Thunderbolt, the aircraft he would pilot in combat against the German military forces in the air or on the ground. Huddleston was assigned to the 404th Fighter Group 506th Fighter Squadron as a replacement pilot. During the final months of the European conflict, he completed 36 combat missions, included one having a direct bearing on the Bankler story. Did I pronounce that right? Hamlet? The young pilot's final combat sortie came in early May 1945 when his flight was directed to monitor the air over the highway leading south out of Prague, Czechoslovakia. As the Soviets began their offensive in the final battle of the war, the 506th Fighter Squadron was to prevent the Germans from bringing up reserve forces. In fact, traffic on the highway headed west consisted of Germans, especially SS units, seeking to escape capture by the Soviets. Huddleston's combat report included, and I quote, one large vehicle destroyed. Could that vehicle have included SS German Hans Kammler? Perhaps. And just so you know, the audience, with us listening in is a bunch of military aviation enthusiasts who enjoys flying simulators over the internet. So safe from the dangers of real-life flying and combat, we fly simulated missions from our desktop simulators that typically looks something like this. I showed him a picture of one of our simulators. These people have written a bunch of questions to me, which I will forward to you. And I can assure you that they are quite eager to hear your story. So let's jump straight into it, shall we?
Sure. I'm ready.
All right. So what got you into flying in the first place?
My connection to the Second World War actually began right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when Germany made the big mistake of declaring war on the U.S. I was in my last year of high school, and most of us speculated on where we would go to participate in the conflict. We were unable to get into the Army Air Corps, as it was then called, a branch of the Army, because it required 2 years of college. And that eliminated a vast number of young people, so many that the head of the Army Air Corps finally realized if he stuck to training only those with 2 years of college, he wouldn't have many trainees. Very few young men had a college education in 1942. Fortunately, by the end of the year, the head of the Army Air Corps decided to drop the requirement, and if you could pass a written test, you could be taken into Army Air Corps training. Out of my close group of 6, 2 of us qualified for training, myself and a friend who qualified for training in the Navy. I was sworn into the Army Air Corps, as it was called then, in November of 1942, but I had to wait a while because the training facilities were jammed up, so I didn't actually begin training until the summer of 43, when I was ordered to report to San Antonio, Texas. Training began with what is called classification, where they tested you to see whether you would do better as a pilot or a navigator or a bombardier. Fortunately, I qualified for pilot training and entered the first stage that fall, which was called pre-flight. I did not do well in pre-flight because for some reason that escaped me, it required a good knowledge of mathematics, classes that I had pretty much ignored in high school. So I proceeded to fail that stage of the training and was held back a month. My wife feels that maybe that month saved my life, but I never agreed with her. I was dropped out of my class, which was then 44-4, which meant I would have graduated in April of 1944, but I actually received my pilot's wings in May of 1944. Now that was the completion of 9 months of progressively difficult training, each stage elevated to an aircraft of more power. The first stage was in a biplane fixed landing gear where you soloed for the first time. If you completed primary of 9 weeks, and by passing, you passed a check. Now, these were civilian pilots in the first stage, but you were got a check ride by an Army flying pilot, and he had the power, the authority to declare you in or out. And fortunately, I got a check ride with a pilot that was satisfied, and I moved on to basic training, which was in an aircraft of a bit more power, the Vultee Basic Trainer 13. Not a very good aircraft, but for training purposes, I guess it served its purpose. But if you advance to the next stage, you really entered into training into an aircraft was on the edge of being worthy of being a fighter aircraft. The Army identified as the AT-6, single engine, landing gear retractable. That ended in May of 1944, and I received not only my silver wings, but a commission as a second lieutenant and the unofficial title of being an officer and a gentleman, which my friend Jim Seitzer here won't quite understand, but I was an official gentleman. Anyway, I was kept over along with my classmates, and we received 10 hours flight time in the P-40, which was then the aircraft, the combat aircraft of the Army Air Corps, and some might remember it as being the aircraft of the American volunteers that fought the Japanese. It was a outmoded aircraft, but it did very well in combat against the Zero. I believe a few might have reached Europe, but they were probably flying out of Italy because I never met any. The first aircraft from the U.S. Army Air Corps was the P-47 Thunderbolt. The first group, the 56 fighter group, was delivered to England in early 1942. The pilots had about 50 hours of training, and it was their first experience in combat against the German FW-109. No, the ME-109. I don't think the FW-190 had been in combat yet. But there was Americans in the battle before that as volunteers that flew the RAF. And if you don't know the history of the American volunteers in the RAF, you ought to go look because they were a fabulous group. And fortunately, one of the pilots of the volunteers that flew with the RAF was named Carroll McAlpin, and he was considered the best pilot among the Americans. He became my group commander in 1944 when my fighter group, the 404th, came to England as a member of the 9th Tactical Air Force. Now, there were three air forces in England. First, the 8th Air Force Strategic Bombing Command, which entered the war in bombing the population centers in Germany. A strategy that never really produced much, but that's another story. The Tactical Fighter Group was the 9th Air Force, which came to Europe in May of 1944, and their job was to prepare themselves to give the ground forces the protection they needed when the invasion of the continent over Normandy began, which eventually came on June 6. My group was headed by Carroll McAlpin, which was one of the great fighter pilots of World War II, who eventually became a major general of the Air Force. I was not there in those early days. I went to Europe at the end of 1944 as a replacement pilot. Now, the 404th Fighter Group was made up of three squadrons, the 506, 507, and 508. And I was assigned to the 506. Early on, their first air base in England was at Winkton. Later on, after D-Day, they moved to the continent and were stationed in several temporary bases because the role of the Tactical Air Force was to protect the ground forces. In fact, members of the 404th flew over the landings at Normandy, and Colonel Carroll McAlpin addressed his pilots ahead of time. He says, "You will defend the ground forces. If you run out of ammunition and they show up, ram them." And he meant it. By the time I got there in 44, they had kept pace with the ground armies flying protective force over the first army elements. And they were then stationed in Belgium at a small town east of Brussels, so-called St. Trond, or in the Flemish St. Triden. It was a fabulous base. It had been a Belgian Air Force base taken over by the Luftwaffe, who improved it. It had one of the best runways in Europe, a concrete runway about 10,000 feet. And on one emergency landing, I used all 10,000 feet. I was, as a replacement pilot, a wingman. We had a facility of a separate barracks called the Wingman's Roost. It had walls about 6 inches thick with steel shutters, and we felt we were perfectly safe from the Luftwaffe attacks, of which there was one, the last one being on New Year's Day, 1945, when Hermann Goering put up every aircraft he could find, and about 100 German fighters flew west to attack Allied air bases, of which St. Trond was one of them. It's interesting that one of the German piloting an FW-190 decided the war was all but over, and he decided that the best place to be was to land at the base he was supposed to attack. We haven't figured out how he got through all the gunfire, but he did. He landed, he climbed out of the FW-190 only to see a mad rush towards him of Allied soldiers, American soldiers. He thought he was about to be lynched. Actually, these were ground troops. The first one to get to the German pilot got possession of his Luger. That was an important souvenir not available to the ground troops. Anyway, when I got there, there was an FW-190 in beautiful shape, and our commanding officer at that time, Colonel McAlpin, had moved up to wing headquarters, and our commanding officer was a young 5'5" guy named Leo Moon, who no wingman wanted to fly with him because Leo Moon led a mission. He was the first one over target and the last one to leave with the wingman running out of fuel. And many a wingman was heard saying, flight leader, his code name Red One, I'm low on fuel. I'm low on fuel. And Leo Moon would radio back, one more pass, one more. So wingman did not appreciate flying with Leo Moon, but I did. I've flown in some of his combat missions, of which it was the end of the war, but not the end of the fighting. A lot of people say when they hear I didn't get there till January of 45, oh hell, the war was all over. Well, there were a lot of people getting killed in this war that it was almost over. In fact, I lost my wingman. We attacked an air base. He went over too low and slow. I thought I was going to be a prime target, but he was the target. He came off the target burning. He said, fly up and tell me where the plane, the P-47's on fire. As I got close to him, he bailed out. It was too late. He was badly burned. And he landed in enemy territory. And we got a later report when the Soviets captured the base that the Air Force would give him no aid, and he died of his burns. He died in agony. I completed 36 combat missions. A couple of them were escorts, which was rather dumb. I'm sorry, not dumb, dull, D-U-L-L. Although one of them we did encounter ME-262 twin engine fighters, of course, the most advanced fighter of World War II. Fortunately, they didn't have very many, and I got on the tail of this ME-262 jet fighter, and he got away from me. I'll admit it. So anyway, I had one other escort mission of medium bombers, rather dull, but most of the time we were either attacking air bases or flying cover for ground forces. Now, our commanding general at that time, General Pete Posada, introduced pilots being stationed in the lead tank of any unit because the pilot knew what the pilots in the air could see and couldn't see. And it was a beautiful arrangement. And that was the extent of our technocracy, technology. We could communicate between pilot and the pilot in a tank. And he would say, yes, they entered such and such a forest. About a half mile into that forest, they're waiting for you. We would dive bomb and strafe. And the odds are we could do a lot of damage to the German ground forces. We were always especially pleased when we provided cover for a ground unit and could get a response from the officer on the ground saying, "Well done, men. You got them."
Yeah.
That was success. By then, most of the German fighters were dedicated to attacking the bombers, which was a waste of talent because the bombers did little to end the war. Unfortunately, the head of the Army Air Forces felt that we bombed the population centers as the British did at night. The British people would rise up and declare that the war's got to end. It didn't work that way. It strengthened the German will to continue, just like the bombing of Britain reinforced the will of the British people to carry on and stay cool. That pretty much sums up, but I can tell you this. In the minds of many pilots, the P-47 Thunderbolt was the best fighter of World War II. Two reasons. Number one, it could take one hell of a lot of damage. And it could also outdive any fighter, enemy or otherwise. So if they sneaked up behind you, you just rolled over and went down and you were gone. There was a test pilot back, I believe, in the 80s that evaluated all of the aircraft, and he rated the P-47 as the best fighter. And one of his arguments was any damn fool could be a good pilot of a P-47. The original P-47 pilots went to England, was a 56 fighter group with P-47s. And when the Mustang came along that everybody loved, the 56 fighter group would not give up their P-47s. And wouldn't you believe it? The 56 fighter group shot down more enemy aircraft in aerial combat than any Mustang group of the 8th Air Force. Fortunately, one of the top aces of the 56 name was Bob Johnson, who destroyed 27 aircraft in aerial combat, which beat the record of the American Eddie Rickenbacker of World War I. Major Bob Johnson became head of training at the Abilene Air Force Base, of which I was assigned in 1944. I started P-47 training in Wendover, Utah, a great field, long runway, good weather, but we were forced out of there to make room for the B-29 bombers that eventually dropped the atomic bombs on Japan. I was one of about a dozen reassigned to Abilene to find Bob Johnson, our head of training. He believed that you could not have too much training. The more training you got, the better chance you had of surviving against the experienced pilots of the Luftwaffe. So Bob Johnson went to Europe with 50 hours in the P-47. By the time I got there, I had about 150 hours. And I can tell you from experience, the more training you have, the more cocky you are when you're in the air. You think you're the better pilot. It does give you that confidence. And I once wrote an article about what it took to be an ace. And heading the list was confidence in your aircraft. One of the things was you had the eyesight equal to that of a hawk. You saw the enemy before he saw you. And secondly, you were confident in your ability. And I think that still held true. Plus, one that is rarely mentioned, but a good fighter pilot in combat does not have a good imagination, which means he doesn't believe or he doesn't think about what might happen. He concentrates on what does happen. And I can tell you, I never called myself ace quality because I have a pretty good imagination. And today I write fiction stories about World War II.